Hi, everyone, and welcome to this lecture for Chapter 16. So again, still here in Unit 4, talking about sort of some of the more social aspects of nutrition. Chapter 16 is another one of my favorite chapters, or at least it covers some of my favorite topics, I guess, within the very broad field of nutrition. So we're going to talk about some things, including food equity. I used to call this chapter, I guess, I used to give it its own name, and I would call it environmental nutrition. So it's sort of taking a broader look at nutrition rather than looking at just how an individual person eats and how the food contributes to the overall healthfulness of a person's body. This chapter looks a little bit more at food production, looks at the healthfulness of people who work in food production, looks at the sustainability of our food supply. And so in that regard, kind of considers more the environment in which we're producing food that can be nutritious or not nutritious. So just taking a broader look at nutrition, which I think is really interesting and really important. So we'll start this chapter by talking about food insecurity. And we're going to talk also about, I guess, many concepts, I suppose, that relate to food insecurity. So your textbook defines food insecurity as unreliable access to a sufficient supply of nourishing food and inequities in agriculture and food service employment. So the first part of the lecture, we're gonna look at kind of this first definition of food insecurity, and then we're gonna talk more about these inequities or injustices as maybe a more common current term that you might be hearing. So you might hear of food justice or environmental justice. So that's kind of what this second bullet is getting at. So justices or injustices in the employment of people who work in the agriculture sector and who work in food service. So I just want to kind of revisit this first definition though. So food insecurity being an unreliable access to a sufficient supply of nourishing food. So I guess in other words, food insecurity means a person is not able to get enough healthy food, right? They have access to food, probably to some amount of food, but it might be food from a corner store, which might be soda and chips, or maybe cheese and chips or pretzels or candy or something of that nature. So yes, they have access to calories, but what someone who is food insecure or who is experiencing food insecurity, what they're experiencing is not being able to get healthy food that nourishes their body and not being able to get enough of it. So that is a really important concept to understand because it's quite prevalent in the United States and of course around the world as well. So food insecurity contributes to life expectancy, right? Hopefully that's a pretty obvious connection. Someone who is experiencing food insecurity is likely to not have the same life expectancy as someone who is able to access nourishing food. And certainly also food insecurity contributes more to infant mortality than households or families or communities where food insecurity is not so prevalent. And then of course, globally compared to in the United States, there are certainly different rates of infant mortality and life expectancy based on many, many factors, one of which is food insecurity. So the Food and Agricultural Organization, which you maybe have heard of through other classes or just through other parts of life, so the FAO, they've estimated that about 11% of the global population is chronically undernourished. And again, this varies throughout the world. Prevalence, I guess, varies throughout the world depending on where we're looking. But 11%, that's basically a tenth of the global population, is not necessarily food insecure, but I suppose we could venture to say they're probably food insecure if they're chronically undernourished. Remember, undernourished would basically be similar to this definition of food insecurity. So if you're undernourished, you're not consuming enough nourishing food. Again, you may be getting enough calories, but they may not be calories, they may be empty calories. So they may not be calories that are providing the important vitamins and minerals or enough of carbohydrate, fat, or protein. So let's look a little more specifically within the United States. Of course, I don't know that I have the most recent data here, but these numbers are from 2016. So in 2016, in the United States, about 12% of US households were experiencing food insecurity. And so again, just a little more definition there. What that means is that throughout the year in 2016, members of these households were either uncertain of having or unable to get enough food to meet their needs. And then 5% of households experienced very low food insecurity, which meant that one or more members of the household had to reduce the quality, variety, or desirability of their food choices and the amount of their food choices. And when we say quality, variety, and desirability, we're referring to quality, variety, and desirability of healthful foods, as well as the amount of them. And so in this case, the people represented by this statistic were experiencing hunger, right? True hunger, where that physiologic need for calories and nutrition was hard to meet, right? It was hard to satisfy due to either low income or due to low access. So we're going to talk about this piece around access in this chapter. So what are some of these risk factors? As I just kind of mentioned a couple of them, what are some of these risk factors for food insecurity? What things might be in place that cause a person or a household or a family to be experiencing food insecurity? So certainly income is a major component of this, right? We are in a time where, unfortunately, healthy food, not across the board, but a lot of the time, healthy foods do appear to cost more upfront, right? If you're going to buy a variety of different vegetables, that might cost more than going to McDonald's or Burger King upfront. But obviously, there are sort of hidden costs in here, which is, right, if somebody's subsisting on burgers and fries from McDonald's, there may be health consequences down the line which require medical treatment or potentially medication, and that is costly. Whereas if we subsist more on the vegetables and the dry beans and the whole grains, there may be less need for medical care down the road, and thereby avoiding those medical costs in the future. But the initial upfront price appears to be greater for vegetables. So compared to some other foods, again, like soda or chips, those are usually the most inexpensive items in the grocery store. So anyway, income is certainly a component of food insecurity. So households with incomes that are below 185% of the US poverty threshold, so that would be about $25,000 for a family of 4. So basically significantly below the poverty threshold is what this is saying. Because $25,000 a year to feed a family of 4 is not enough money in the 21st century. So households or families, or I guess this statement is saying mostly families. So families where the income is so significantly below even the poverty threshold. So these are households living well below the poverty line. So that's certainly a risk factor for food insecurity. We see that single parent households are also a risk factor for food insecurity, not to say that all single parent households experience food insecurity. But again, if it's a single parent, that means there's a single income coming from one parent. most likely, and it means parent, so it means there are offspring or children. So again, it's feeding more than one mouth off of a single income. And then, of course, we see racial disparities. So we see African American households and Hispanic households in the United States tend to also be at greater risk for food insecurity than white or Caucasian households. And then there are some other risk factors. So chronic disease, again, the cost of medical treatment and medication to manage chronic disease, that's also going to contribute to less income available to buy healthful food. People experiencing disability, potentially out of work, of course, that's further going to contribute to a lower income. People experiencing ongoing depression, certainly where addiction is involved, whether drug addiction or alcohol addiction. And then even divorce. So these are further risk factors for food insecurity. More so for females, it seems to be, than for males. Again, divorce might lead to a single parent household. So some other things that might cause food insecurity. So food shortages. This slide doesn't really offer a straight definition for food shortage, but a food shortage is basically meaning there's not enough food to feed the population, right? There's a shortage of food. So two things that cause food shortages, and now we're not just talking in the United States, but globally too. So two things that we see causing food shortages are weather events and certainly wars, right? So these two things can lead to decreased food supply or like decreased availability of the food supply to a large population of people. And then famine is a type of food shortage. So famine is a very severe food shortage that affects a large percentage of a population in a limited area at a particular time. So certainly a famine could be caused by a war or could be caused by severe weather events. So famine is a type of food shortage. Throughout the world, it's estimated that about 489 million of 815 million chronically undernourished people do live in countries that are affected by conflict or affected by wars. So what this statistic is saying is that slightly more than half of people who are undernourished are likely experiencing that undernourishment due to conflict and wars. And then down here is some examples of these weather events that might cause food shortages. And we're certainly seeing a lot of this, I guess in recent years, I mean to say, with changing climate. So some weather events that can certainly lead to food shortages, floods and droughts, very common, high winds, certainly, tsunamis, hurricanes, early frosts, late frosts, pest infestations, and plant diseases. So we definitely see a lot of these. I guess not all of those are weather related, but they are all climate related. So any of these can lead to a destruction of crops, which would mean like a shortage of crops being plants that we grow for food. And so if we have a destruction of the crops, we're going to have a lower yield, a lower harvest. There's going to be less food available to put on the table, or less food available even in the grocery stores. So fewer people are able to access this food. So certainly weather events and climatic changes are affecting the food supply. So I mentioned hunger on one of the first slides. So hunger, right? You or I may experience hunger periodically throughout the day or throughout the week. But in this case, when we're talking about hunger, I suppose maybe more apt to say chronic hunger. So chronic hunger, chronic meaning ongoing, right? So chronic hunger is like a hunger that can't be satiated, again, due to this issue of food insecurity. So it's not a hunger that can't be satiated because you had school and then you had to go to work, and it wound up being a 12 or a 14-hour day. But when you got home, you were able to eat something. This is hunger like, we don't have enough food to put on the table today, tomorrow, the next day, even next week. So this is a hunger that persists for days and weeks, months, due to not enough access to healthful food. So the major cause for chronic hunger is unequal distribution of healthful foods. And this is, again, in the United States and worldwide. I guess we're currently dealing with this issue of overpopulation, where we have resources that are insufficient to support the number of people living in a given area or living, globally. So some things that we could do to address chronic hunger is certainly to address our food supply. So some things that might improve our food supply, certainly slowing population growth, right? Then you're starting to address this issue of overpopulation. That's an easier said than done type of thing. Obviously, some countries have tried to actually set laws around population growth, but doesn't always pan out so well. But anyhow, we do have to consider this issue of human overpopulation. Some other, I guess, ideas or things that are being implemented, I suppose, around the world. So improving access to education for females, especially for young girls, young females around the world. There are still parts of the world where access to education is sort of only allowed for males and for male children, and certainly allowing that education to be for everyone would do a lot, I guess. But in one instance, it would allow for both males and females to be educated about these issues, even of hunger and overpopulation and reproduction and childbearing, and how many children might be realistic for one family to have. Certainly also improving options for contraceptives for both males and females, not just for females. And then, of course, looking at various ways to improve the efficiency of our food production, the safety of our food production, as well as imported and exported foods. So kind of coming back here, when we say things like increase food production, what that means is looking at different agricultural practices so that we are allowing for a healthy, sustainable production of food that can go on for decades, even potentially for centuries, without having maleffect on the environment in which these foods are produced. So we'll talk about some agricultural practices that maybe have actually been contributing to chronic hunger. So 4 concepts on this page: deforestation, overgrazing, growing food for livestock, and then this concept of cash crops. So all of these are referring to agricultural practices. And in this case, these are practices that have been in place now for quite some time, I guess I'd say for several decades. And what we're seeing is that maybe there was value right in the beginning to doing these things, but now these 4 things have actually caused quite a serious problem, both at the environmental level, at the climate level, and we're seeing that these agricultural practices are now contributing to poor food supply, which is a component of chronic hunger. So deforestation. Deforestation is kind of, again, as the word would imply, de meaning kind of to undo or against, foresting, right? So deforestation is basically the destruction of forests. So we're destroying trees and tree roots. And oftentimes we have engaged, I guess humans, I'll say, have engaged in deforestation. So basically tearing down forests to use that land then to grow food, right? So maybe at some point we thought this was a worthwhile practice because it seemed like, okay, well, forests, what are the forests doing? Why don't we use that land to grow food? But what we're seeing is that forests are actually critical in terms of managing a lot of severe weather events. Forests do a lot to preserve ecosystems, to preserve soil. And what we see is that when forests actually are allowed to remain in place, we see much different, I guess I'll say, issues related to winds and water. So we see a lot less sort of damage from high rains, a lot fewer mudslides, and we also see much more mild winds because the forests are sort of these really fascinating, I think, parts of our planet that kind of help to regulate water and help to regulate wind. So as we tear down forests, and for example, if you're interested, a lot of this is going on right now in the Amazon rainforest, literally tearing down the Amazon rainforest to provide ground to graze cattle. I don't even think we need to really say how potentially damaging that will be to our climate at large on this planet. So anyhow, deforestation is one such practice that has been in place, is currently in place to provide land for agriculture, but we're seeing that it is has really negative effects, I guess. Another issue is overgrazing. So overgrazing is basically, again, overgrazing livestock. So your cattle or your sheep or your hogs or chicken or turkey, whatever. Typically it's cows. So having them graze on the same track, the same plot of land over and over and over again. So what we see is that depletes the soil of nutrients because the soil and the vegetation there is really never given a chance to regrow. And so over time, we see that land becomes, I guess, pretty vacant, kind of empty. So very little can actually grow there. There's a concept similar to with just growing crops on the same plot of land over and over and over again. And the same thing happens when you grow the same crops on the same land year after year after year after year. You actually see the same thing. You see the same depletion of soil mass, soil nutrition, soil microbes, soil ecosystems. And so long term for crop production, you also see a significant reduction in crop yields. There's also, I think this one is a really interesting, this issue of growing food for livestock. So again, growing food to feed cattle or to feed pigs or to feed chicken or turkey. And this is more so an issue with the larger animals, especially cows. It takes so much food to feed these animals. And then when you slaughter one cow, maybe that would feed so many human beings. But what's fascinating is if you actually just took the food that fed the cow, you could feed so many more people from the food that fed the cow than you can from just the single cow alone. So it's kind of wild, I think, when you think about it. Part of what we're doing in our agriculture systems right now is putting so many land and natural resources to feeding animals. And then, yes, we slaughter those animals to feed humans, but we've sort of, I'll say, wasted, I guess, so much food that could have actually gone straight to humans, or at least resources between the land and the other, water and other soil inputs. We could have actually used all that land to grow food for humans instead of growing it for the livestock and then eating the livestock. So, yeah, that's a really interesting one. And then again, when we clear land to grow livestock or to grow food for livestock, again, we're commonly clearing forest land to grow livestock. Then another interesting piece about agricultural practices is that we use a lot of agricultural land to grow cash crops. And cash crops are basically they're plants that we grow, but they're plants that we don't eat. So things like cotton, coffee, and tobacco, these are three of the most, I guess, abundant or common cash crops worldwide. So they're plants that we have to cultivate and grow. So they require agricultural land. They require many of the same natural inputs, again, water, different nutrients, healthful soils. But we don't get any caloric or nutritive benefit from these things, right? Nobody is subsisting, nobody is thriving or eating cotton or eating tobacco or eating coffee even, right? Coffee is actually sort of a treat or a delicacy or an extra. We're not getting nutritional value from coffee. So we give a lot of agricultural land or use a lot of agricultural land to grow these crops that don't feed us. And so we're kind of using up some of this agricultural land where we could actually be using what are called subsistence crops. I should have bolded that one. So understanding cash crops versus subsistence crops, these are two important terms to know. So subsistence crops are actually food crops. And two examples, again, this is worldwide, but sorghum, which is a sort of a type of grain, like similar to, oats or wheat or something, and then corn, which is actually also a grain. But these are two of the most commonly grown subsistence crops, meaning food crops that we can subsist on, meaning we can eat them and we get nourishment and we get calories from them. And then also in this same bullet, actually, there's the same concept that listed in the third bullet that we might use some cash crops actually to feed livestock. So again, it goes into livestock rather than using that land for humans directly. And so all this is to say that ultimately this use of agricultural land for cash crops means that there's less actual food being grown for human consumption. And this also says local consumption. This is a really interesting, interesting is an interesting word to use, but this is a really important issue actually globally, where many different countries around the world are growing crops that are either cash crops or they may be subsistence crops, but they're actually being exported to oftentimes, I guess, wealthier countries like the United States. And so this is a really interesting issue, because the people in the communities growing these foods, they're using their local land to grow these foods that are then exported, or these crops, if it's not a subsistence crop, that are then exported. So then in those local communities, their land has been given up for export. And so there's less food available in those local communities where they're growing these crops that get exported, again, often to wealthier countries, especially coffee, for example. Right? That's a major issue. Many of the coffee growing regions around the world are in parts of the world that are much more economically disadvantaged. So those lands in those areas are being used for coffee production, not for food for the local communities. And then the coffee is being exported, but then there's no food in those local communities to put on the table. So really interesting issue, I think, and important issue. Okay, so other things that can lead to chronic hunger: infrastructure or lack thereof, right? So any of these things we need to get healthy food to the people, and also to help people understand what healthy food is. So when any of these things are lacking, it can exacerbate the scarcity of healthy food and access to the healthy food. So of course we need roads and transportation, both to get food from the farm to the market or to the cities so that people can buy it. But then individuals also need transportation to get to the grocery store, get to the market to buy food and bring it home. Certainly in the 21st century, we need electricity and refrigeration. Being able to access the food is one thing, but then being able to take it home and either, keep it cool, keep it refrigerated, or have electricity to plug your refrigerator in, or have electricity to, power a stove or an oven or a microwave to be able to prepare the food. That's really important. Also water management systems, so especially for safe drinking water, but then also water management to irrigate crops, to irrigate fields, and also water management to help remove sewage and safely, process or deal with waste. Same thing, sanitation services, so making sure that the healthy food is still clean and healthy. And then the last three are kind of more, again, towards the public health end of this sort of infrastructure concept. So communicating about healthy food and, how to prepare it, where to purchase it. Also healthcare delivery and public education kind of all tie into kind of a knowledge base about what healthy food is, why it's important to eat it, how to eat it, where to acquire it, and so on and so forth. So any one of these things, when any one of these things is missing, it starts to increase the risk for food insecurity, which can lead to chronic hunger. Alrighty, and then, obviously chronic hunger is a problem unto itself, but chronic hunger can certainly also set the stage for greater likelihood of contracting a disease or developing a disease. And then it kind of becomes this vicious cycle. So where chronic hunger exists and then disease enters, there's usually a lack of health care, or lack of, I should say, access to health care to address the disease. And so that can lead to a reduction in work capacity for the individual or for the family or in the community. And so this is where it really becomes cyclical, because then if someone is chronically hungry, now they have some sort of chronic disease, they can't get access to health care, so they have to now take time off work or take leave for an indeterminate amount of time. Okay, well now we've added to this mix a lack of income. And so now we run into the issue of poverty, or even more severe poverty. And as we know that super low income or even low income is one of the risk factors for food insecurity. So now it becomes an even larger burden where someone was already chronically hungry to begin with, developed disease because their immune system wasn't healthful enough. Then they had to take time off work. Now they are low on income. So now it perpetuates the cycle, right? So now it kind of furthers the malnutrition associated with this. Your textbook gives the example of the AIDS epidemic. Certainly true. So individuals experiencing or dealing with AIDS, certainly that's such a severe, and it was at the time before we really understood how to treat it, such a severe illness. So it put people, certainly reduced their work capacity, put them out of work. And what we saw was in instances where an individual had AIDS and had children, if AIDS led to their death, it resulted in those children becoming orphaned, also being impoverished already because now having loss of a parent, but also that parent was ill and unable to work, so the children were already probably living in an impoverished situation even prior to the death of their parent. And so it sort of sets this stage for this cycle of impoverished children who then might go on and lead a more impoverished life, and kind of setting up this cycle for food insecurity and hunger and potential to contract disease themselves down the road. Okay, so coming back, I guess, to this concept on climate change and the effects of kind of the relationship between agriculture and climate change, or even how our climate has been changing and how that changes this environment in which we are trying to produce food. So when we talk about climate changing, we'll start with this concept of global warming. So global warming is quite evident. So it's sort of this increasing temperature of the Earth. And this has been going on for several years, I guess even decades, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just this general kind of gradual increase in temperature along the Earth's surface. So that's really what global warming is. It's literally the warming of this planet. Most scientists agree that global warming, yeah, it's sort of, maybe that's something that's naturally occurring, but it is certainly being exacerbated at the very least, if not actually outright caused by, it's at least being exacerbated by human activities, meaning made worse by human activities. And not just any human activity, but specific human activities that lead to a greater input of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, and then also contribute to less carbon dioxide being pulled out of the atmosphere. And then other greenhouse gases as well, so other gases that kind of get trapped in the Earth's atmosphere and cause this increase in temperature. So I guess that's what this parenthesis is saying, is that these gases actually start to trap the heat close to the Earth's surface. So as these gases accumulate in the Earth's atmosphere, they sort of start to create this sort of barrier that keeps heat tucked in near the Earth's surface, rather than allowing it to move out further into space. So global warming certainly contributes to climate change, right? As the temperatures near the Earth's surface are increasing, that's going to change quite a lot about, again, water movement and wind patterns. So what we see is changing in our climate. And so climate change can be defined as any significant change in various measures of climate over several decades. So again, I guess the two that stand out to me are certainly, as I said, water and wind patterns. So changes in precipitation, right? Exceptionally heavy rains or exceptionally long droughts, decreasing snowfall, and then changing in wind patterns, right? So again, I guess one of the things that stands out to me are excessively high winds, even persisting for prolonged periods of time. And then also kind of these erratic changes in temperature could be a signal of the changing climate. So how does climate change affect global food security? So food security is hopefully obviously just sort of the opposite of food insecurity. And so I suppose anytime we're talking about one, we're talking about both, right? Because wherever there's food insecurity, the goal might be to improve food security. And wherever there is food security, the goal might be to understand what bolsters that food security and how can we bring more food security to more people throughout the world. So climate change affects food security 3 ways that we'll list here. Again, the change in temperatures, the change in precipitation, and then kind of an interesting concept around how individual people might try to address some of these changes. So high temperatures, right? With increasingly high temperatures, we tend to see a reduction in crop yields. There are certain crops, many crops that are very nutritious that actually don't do well in very high heat. And so when the temperatures are too high, we see lower production of certain crops, and also potential for reduced nutritional quality of those crops. Also in high temperatures, we see that many pests actually thrive in heat. So it's kind of a double whammy, I guess you could say, where the crops aren't going to do so well in the high heat to begin with, and then pests that eat those crops are going to do really well in the high heat. So they're going to feed on these crops, further reducing their output or their yield. And then variability of rainfall. So again, periods of drought where there isn't any water, and also periods of heavy rain where there's way too much water. Right? So either one of those is going to lead to reduced food production. If you've ever tried to care for a plant at home, even just a house plant, if it's not a food plant, you might start to notice like the plants, just like a human, right? We can't have too much water and we can't have too little water. Kind of needs to be just right in the middle. And even with humans, I guess we have talked about that in the last unit, in unit 3, we talked about the danger of having too much water come into your body and how that can throw off your electrolyte balance, I guess we can say. So same thing with plants. If they have too much water, the major issue there is that too much water can actually move the nutrients in the soil, out of reach of the roots of the plant. So then, kind of similar to humans, the plants aren't able to get enough of the nutrients out of the soil. And then again, of course, with a drought, if the plant doesn't get enough water, it can't thrive. So anyway, droughts and heavy rain can lead to reduced food production. And then this last bullet, it kind of comes back to cutting down trees. So in some parts of the world, maybe we've seen that a household where their resources are really strained, if they have access to some trees, maybe they would cut the trees down either to sell as firewood or use it as firewood themselves. But as we briefly talked about before with deforestation, trees and their roots are really critical for maintaining soil. And so as tree roots get destroyed and as trees get destroyed and their roots are no longer maybe as functional or as vital, the soil in those areas is more prone to erosion. And erosion is just simply this process of soil getting kind of swept away, again, by heavy wind and rain. So cutting down, like excessive cutting down of trees, certainly contributes to soil erosion. But then there's this other factor of trees, which is that trees trap carbon dioxide. So when we talked, let me go back to this slide, when we said that human activities release large amounts of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and those gases trap heat, well, that's only half the story. The other half of the story is that there are many natural processes on planet Earth that sequester or take these gases back out of the atmosphere, thus reducing the problem of them being in the atmosphere. One of the natural carbon sequestering components of the planet are trees. So and we saw this even when that first carbohydrate slide, when we talked about carbohydrates, right? Plants take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and use it to make nutrients in their leaves and in their branches in the tree. So having trees around helps to actually reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, helping to reduce the problem of greenhouse gases. So when we cut trees down, first of all, we eliminate the tree's ability to trap carbon dioxide, but then what's kind of a really weird sort of mind twist is that if we then chop those logs up and burn them, well, all of that carbon dioxide was sequestered as carbon in the tree. And so now if we're going to burn the tree as firewood, we're releasing all that carbon back into the atmosphere. So kind of three really interesting issues that arise from taking trees down that kind of further the issues of climate change. Okay, so everything we've been talking about so far kind of circles back to this issue of malnutrition. We introduced malnutrition back in Unit 1, But malnutrition, just as a review, again, is basically poor. I guess I could use the word bad. It's not a word I like to use, but poor nutrition, meaning not good nutrition, meaning there's a lack of something, right? Or there's not enough of something, or maybe there's an imbalance of something. So malnutrition, we can further define in two ways. We can have undernutrition, which is a form of malnutrition, but we can also have overnutrition, which is also a form of poor nutrition. So undernutrition, remember, is not getting enough. And when we talked about this in Unit 1, we didn't say not getting enough to eat. We said either not getting enough calories or potentially not getting enough of certain nutrients, right? So maybe not getting enough iron, maybe not getting enough iodine, maybe not getting enough calcium, or maybe not getting enough magnesium. So undernutrition is not getting enough either of calories or of a specific nutrient. We also talked about not getting enough protein. So protein undernutrition in parts of the world where access to food is very scarce. And then overnutrition, a different form of malnutrition, that comes about from excessive consumption of energy dense, meaning calorie dense foods, along with inadequate physical activity. So overnutrition is obviously too much, and typically it's too much of calorie-laden foods that don't provide good nutrition otherwise. So I think I've got 2 or 3 slides here to talk about some of the issues associated with undernourishment, and then we'll talk in a moment about overnourishment. So again, undernourishment meaning not enough, right? So undernourishment is a nutritional imbalance caused by either inadequate energy intake or basically inadequate nutrient intake. So 2 things that can be caused by undernourishment: wasting and stunted growth. So wasting is where, quite literally, we see that the body is kind of wasting away. So we see a very low body weight for the height of a person. And often this visually looks like extreme thinness. So wasting is a hallmark of what's called severe acute malnutrition. Again, where the malnutrition is so excessive, so severe in an acute or specific sort of period of time. That can lead to wasting. And then another thing that we see with undernourishment or undernutrition is stunted growth. And so this is sort of when we see chronic undernourishment, so kind of ongoing, like there's sort of, the person is sort of getting like just enough to be surviving, but they're really seriously undernourished. So what we see is shorter height for the person's chronological age. And so that's why their vertical growth is stunted. And it's estimated that about 155 million children worldwide experience stunted growth as a result of undernourishment. And then we can even see certainly increased mortality as a result of undernourishment, and that's both maternal mortality and infant mortality. So maternal mortality is the death of the female during pregnancy, during childbirth, or in the immediate period following delivery, so immediately postpartum, immediately after giving birth. So with undernourishment, so if a female is pregnant and undernourished, her risk of death, or that person's risk of death at childbirth or even during pregnancy is much greater than someone who is not undernourished. And then again, we see an increased risk for infant mortality, again, where the pregnant person is undernourished. So that's increased risk for the infant between birth and 1 year of age. And so that would also be a result of an undernourished person while trying to breastfeed, or in that first year of life after giving birth, not being able to provide enough nourishment to the newborn baby. Some other things that would affect the infant in this case would be decreased resistance to infection. So an infection may be the cause of death. And so again, if a baby's born and the mother is not able to produce sufficient breast milk to feed the baby, one of the things we get from breast milk, we'll actually learn about this in Unit 5, are antibodies. So if the baby's not able to get enough antibody kind of help from the mom, then that would obviously lead to increased risk for developing or succumbing to infection. And then we also see, again, kind of a spiraling effect. So where the infant is not able to get enough nourishment and potentially resulting in an infection, the infection may lead to reduced appetite. The infection may cause vomiting or diarrhea, and so that may further the weight loss and further weaken the immune system, thus increasing the risk of infant mortality. Here is an image of wasting. So again, kind of, as we said, a hallmark of severe acute malnutrition. So in a really specific period of time, experiencing severe lack of healthy food and lack of enough healthy food. So this is kind of a helpful chart, just going over some of the effects of chronic undernourishment throughout the life cycle. So on the left is the life stage, and on the right is what can result from undernutrition at that life stage. So in fetal development, so during pregnancy, if the pregnant person is undernourished, that can lead to a low birth weight baby, and that can lead to higher infant mortality. And then during infancy, if the child is still undernourished, that can lead to, as we saw, kind of frequent infections. And if the baby survives infancy, it would lead to impaired physical and cognitive development as well. If that undernourishment continues into childhood, or if a child for the first time begins to experience undernourishment, say at 3 years old, 5 years old, 6 years old, again, we're going to see that stunted growth and potential for wasting. We're going to see poor motor development, so poor development of the physical motor skills. We would also likely see behavioral issues, so again, kind of cognitive issues, and reduced mental capacity. So reduced ability to, if they're in school, reduced ability to really pay attention, or even reduced ability to learn. And similar issues would continue into the adolescent period. So, and again, this could be whether the person was undernourished from birth or if they first experienced undernourishment as an adolescent. So this could be anybody, right? At any point, if a person is exposed to undernourishment and chronic undernourishment, if it's during a period of growth, it's going to stunt their physical growth. It's certainly going to stunt the development of strength, like physical strength. And again, it's going to stunt their cognitive development. So reduced ability to learn, reduced ability to perform mental work, and of course, physical work too. And then again, the cycle kind of repeats if we talk about undernourishment during pregnancy. So this would lead to inadequate weight gain of the pregnant person. That, as you see here, can lead to an undernourished fetus, a low birth weight fetus, higher risk for infant mortality. But the undernourished pregnant person is also at greater risk for higher maternal mortality, at higher risk of maternal mortality at the time of childbirth. So this next little section is going to be a little bit of a review of different micronutrients that whose deficiency is most common worldwide. So I think on one of the labs I asked you the question, which is the most common micronutrient deficiency worldwide, and that's iron. Some of you went on to actually include some of these others as similarly common micronutrient deficiencies worldwide. So iron, iodine, vitamin A, vitamin B12, and folate. These are the most common micronutrient deficiencies around the world. So again, some of this will be a review as we've talked about each one of these micronutrients already. So again, iron deficiency is the most common micronutrient deficiency around the world. It is the leading cause of disease and disability among adolescents. And the most serious instances, I guess, of iron deficiency are in low-income countries, many African countries, and many Southeast Asian countries. And then iodine deficiency. So you might remember that iodine during pregnancy is really important for fetal brain development. I know we didn't talk quite a lot about this. It was maybe a similar bullet on a slide like this, but if a pregnant person is deficient in iodine, it's the leading, that can actually be, or is the leading cause of, we talked about cretinism, which is basically mental retardation in the offspring, in the infant. So iodine deficiency can also cause, if it doesn't cause cretinism, it can cause kind of cognitive deficits in school-aged children, which means it can impair cognitive performance. So again, decreased ability to kind of learn in school, to be able to grasp new concepts, to be able to do sort of different reasoning type things. And so just learning at a slower pace than would be expected for that child's age. And then we also see a slowed physical growth and development too. As we actually see commonly in the United States, iodine is often, so many foods are, not many, but some foods are fortified with iodine. Salt is perhaps the most common one, right? Iodized table salt. In some parts of the world, oil or even water used to irrigate crops has been like fortified with iodine or had iodine added to it. And we actually see that parts of the world where this happens, we see that the incidence of iodine deficiency is greatly reduced, which is wonderful. And then vitamin A deficiency, you might remember we talked about vitamin A, specifically with regard to the eye and how the different proteins in the eye kind of receive light and receive some of those signal inputs to be able to send an image or a concept to the brain so that we can see something. So vitamin A deficiency, we talked about, can cause blindness. And so in children, the leading cause of blindness in children is vitamin A deficiency. And then leading cause of blindness, so due to greater vulnerability to severe infection, and then these children would be at a higher risk for death. So it's estimated that about 250 million children worldwide are deficient in vitamin A. And again, as we saw with iodine supplementation or fortification, where we've been able to supplement diets with vitamin A, that has actually reduced mortality, child mortality by 23%. I guess I say we, meaning humanity, but we're international organizations, which we'll talk about coming up, but different international organizations work on issues with nutrition and public health around the globe, and so have created initiatives to supplement local food supply with vitamin A, and that has actually gone quite a long way to reduce mortality caused by vitamin A deficiency. And then we'll talk about several issues that kind of even reviewing some of what we talked about in the beginning of this chapter, but some socioeconomic problems as well as other problems that contribute to these nutrient deficiencies. So socioeconomic problems can also arise from these micronutrient deficiencies. So for example, where a person might be not getting enough iodine, not getting enough B12 or folate, not getting enough iron. That can lead to cognitive impairments, which might lead to a reduced ability to do work or to go to school, and to eventually earn a an income at any level, let alone an income sufficient to put healthful food on the table. Same thing with vitamin A deficiency. If that does cause blindness, right, that can potentially change a person's work capacity or change their ability to get a good job or a well-paying job. And then anywhere where we see malnutrition or undernutrition, I suppose we're still talking about undernutrition, anywhere where we see undernutrition, again, that can lead to, again, both cognitive and physical impairments, which can lead to reduced capacity for work. And if we look at kind of globally, we see that this undernutrition actually is a major cause of reduced work capacity and reduced productivity around the globe. So we'll start to transition into the conversation on overnutrition, but first we're going to talk about this issue of the double burden of malnutrition. So this is where we see both undernourishment and overnourishment. So this concept of the double burden of malnutrition, this is a term that I do want you to recognize and understand. So where we see the double burden of malnutrition, we see the coexistence of both undernutrition and overweight and obesity, as well as diet-related diseases. And this can exist in a single person. This can, of course, exist in a household, and this can, of course, does exist at the population level. So where we see, even in the same city, right, we see some people who are undernourished, and then, we turn around and look the other way, we see people who are overweight and obese, who are overnourished. But again, I think really interestingly, this can be occurring in a single person, right? Because where overnutrition occurs, overnutrition is overconsumption of energy-dense foods. It's overconsumption of calories. It doesn't necessarily mean that a person is getting enough nutrition. It doesn't mean they're necessarily getting enough different micronutrients. So we can see a person who is overweight or obese and also undernourished. So that's what the double burden of malnutrition is that these two things, undernourishment and overnourishment, can exist in the same person, in the same household. So you could have an overweight or an obese person and an undernourished person in the same household. And then, of course, we do see this at the population level. So what are some factors that cause this or play into this double burden of malnutrition? So certainly changes in our lifestyle over the past 50 to 100 years, where we have much more sedentary lifestyles. We have much greater access to energy-dense, undernourishing foods. And then we are just, again, more sedentary, less physically active. And then again, our food supply, we kind of are in the midst of hopefully just a period of time in which our food supply really is emphasizing production of energy-dense foods that do not provide much in the way of micronutrients or fiber. So our food supply is giving us, is providing these excessively energy-dense foods that are not nourishing. So all of these factors contribute to this double burden of malnutrition. Sorry, I feel like, again, these slides are a little wonky here. So fetal undernourishment, kind of bouncing back to fetal undernourishment. So again, where a mother's, or a pregnant person's nutritional status is poor, so where a pregnant person is undernourished, as we've seen, that can affect the offspring in utero, meaning during pregnancy, during gestation, but it can also affect the child it can affect that person. So once the baby is born, that baby can be affected by the poor nutrition that they experienced in utero. They can be affected by that throughout their lifetime, even into adulthood. I don't know that we introduced the fetal origins of adult disease theory before. I think this is the first time we're talking about it. So the fetal origins of adult disease theory is present here in this concept of this poor nutritional status during utero affecting the person throughout their lifetime. So this is kind of a rough definition of the fetal origins of adult disease theory. So this theory suggests that, again, the effects experienced in utero can be passed on to future generations, and it may even take 4 generations of improved, I'll say, food access conditions to overcome the risk for short stature and overweight. So where a fetus experienced poor nutrition during pregnancy, and then that fetus is born and it's an infant, and then it goes on into childhood, adolescence, adulthood, that child is going to be at a greater risk for diseases and issues associated with having experienced that undernourishment during utero. And that those risk factors can be passed on to future generations from that, what was the fetus and has now become an adult, especially if the conditions, meaning the access to healthful food, does not improve. And so if the conditions do improve, the effects of that one fetus, of that one mother, that one pregnant person and the fetus, those effects can actually take 4 future generations, all with improved access to nutrition, to reduce or reverse the risk for issues associated with undernourishment. So that's what this theory suggests. Again, make note that it's a theory. So something that people might commonly think about or talk about in this kind of niche of nutrition and of public health, but certainly not yet proven to be factual. And then very similar to the double burden of malnutrition, we have something called the poverty-obesity paradox. So do take some time to make sure you understand these two separately, because they're 2 different concepts, so they are quite similar. So the poverty-obesity paradox is that we commonly see where obesity exists in low income people who are experiencing low income. These people are also likely to be deficient in 1 or more nutrients, and even potentially experiencing hunger. So that's the poverty-obesity paradox, where we have obesity prevalent in low-income populations, right? And the paradox there is that you might think, okay, well, obesity is an issue of overconsumption. So you might think it only exists where there's more income available to procure more foods. But in fact, that's why this is a paradox, because in fact we see higher rates, higher prevalency of obesity in low-income populations, and that's commonly due to lack of access to healthful food. So the food that is cheapest, the most inexpensive, most easily accessible is food that is, energy dense and not nutritionally robust, not providing a good variety of enough of the micronutrients. In the United States, we see that a reduction in family income during early childhood increases the child's risk for becoming overweight or obese. So income relative to, nutrition status and malnutrition is a really, really, really important risk factor for overweight and obesity later in life. So what are some of the physical and socioeconomic factors that might promote obesity? Again, kind of a review of some of the things we've talked about so far. So people who have a more limited income are more likely to buy low-cost, high-volume foods, which tend to be the most energy-dense foods. So these foods tend to be high in carbohydrates and fats, they tend to be low in protein, and they tend to be low in other micronutrients. So cheap, low-protein foods are also not satiating, and therefore can result in overconsumption of calories. So that's why we said here on this slide that in the obesity, the poverty-obesity paradox, we might see that a person is low income and obese and hungry. You might think, well, how is that possible? Well, it's possible because of the quality of the food available to a low income person or a person with a low income. The quality of those foods are such as written on this page. So they are high in energy density, but they're not satiating, and again, they're not providing a good variety of micronutrients. So very easily can result in hunger because there's nothing satisfying about these foods that are available at a low cost and a high volume. So stress is another factor that can contribute to obesity. And we'll say just a little bit about it here. I'll see if I can find a worthwhile reading online to post to this week's content, because this, I think, is a really important conversation to be had in the context of overweight and obesity. So when we see elevated stress, we see elevated levels of this hormone cortisol. So cortisol is one of the hormones that our body produces in response to stress. I think we're still learning quite a lot about cortisol. We know a lot about it, but I think we're still learning quite a lot about it as well. So we know that cortisol diverts energy from our digestive organs, right? If you think of how your nervous system works, you have the fight or flight nervous system, and you have the rest and digest nervous system, so sympathetic and parasympathetic. So cortisol is going to send our body more towards the fight or flight mode. And so in fight or flight, we're not going to be sitting there digesting food well or doing other basic metabolic functions. We're going to be more in that like mode of fleeing or fighting, right? So cortisol slows metabolism. It can also potentially increase appetite towards the end of its sort of cycle. And then it would also promote kind of short-sighted, like rapid, quick decision making. Right? Again, if you're in that fight or flight mode, you don't have a ton of time to sort of think through things. You just need to do and act and go. And so, again, and this can be stress caused by anything, whether it's work-related or family or relationship or even like existential stress. It's I think sort of amazing the way that stress can affect us, and it doesn't need to be like an actual physical threat like a bear or a tiger chasing us. It can be very just psychological. It can feel a lot more subtle, but its effects are just the same. So people experiencing ongoing stress or chronic stress are more apt to eat empty calorie foods, sometimes called comfort foods, in part because they're easier to access. They require a lot less thought to think about them. And if there is an increase for appetite, oftentimes that appetite is for sugary foods or even fatty foods. And so those tend to be our empty calorie foods. So somebody experiencing more stress, more apt to go for these energy dense foods. Again, as we saw on this page, high in carbohydrate, high in fat foods, low in protein foods. And so that is kind of the recipe for obesity, especially coupled with lack of physical activity. And again, in this day and age when we're experiencing stress, again, it's not actually stress like being chased by a bear. It's oftentimes more occupational stress, relationship stress, psychological stress. So we might be experiencing all this stress, eating these empty calorie foods, and not moving, right? Not getting exercise, not getting physical activity. And so it creates the perfect situation for excessive weight gain. also what we see is when we turn to these higher sugar foods, sugar, especially added sugars, so not just like sugar occurring in an apple or an orange, but added sugar foods like, like what's that popcorn, like kettle popcorn, where it's like dipped in sugar, or it has that whole sugar coating, or candy, or even a lot of boxed cereals are really high in added sugar, ice cream, a lot of granola bars are really high in added sugar. So sugar triggers this feedback loop that basically turns off the stress response for a short period of time, right? So it's sort of like sugar can be this momentary antidote to stress. So if we eat high sugar foods or high added sugar foods, or also like soda, for example, perfect example of a high added sugar food, we might get this momentary stress relief because sugar in the brain literally can help elicit kind of this calming, relaxing effect. But it's not a long-lasting effect. So that can kind of cycle into a kind of a sort of sugar addiction, where somebody who's experiencing a lot of stress may continually turn to sugar over and over and over again to keep trying to get that short-term stress relief. But it's clearly not a long-term solution. So it's kind of all one thing, but I guess if we wanted to parse it out into two different things, stress alone can cause us to reach for more empty calorie, easy access foods, comfort foods, and stress may cause us to reach for more added sugar foods, which itself can create kind of a cyclical response of wanting and needing more and more sugar. And so in these two ways, stress contributes to weight gain and ultimately obesity. Okay, so food deserts. This is a term also that we could go all the way back to the beginning of the chapter when we talk about food insecurity. One of the causes of food insecurity are these food deserts, or oftentimes where we see food insecurity, we see food deserts. So a food desert we can define as a geographical area in which access to a supermarket selling a diversity of healthful foods is limited. So a geographical area that lacks access to a supermarket. Interestingly, we see food deserts most commonly kind of in the deep inner cities and in rural areas. And so in urban areas, so in the inner city, a food desert, we could further define it as an area where there's more than 1 square mile. So like from the center of this food desert, if you go 1 mile in any direction, you cannot access a supermarket. And then furthermore, in an urban area, not owning a vehicle. Well, that would be the same also in a rural area too. So hopefully you're starting to even put this picture in your mind, right? Where you have kind of an urban city area, in any direction you go, 1 mile, you can't even access a healthful supermarket. And so this is we call this a food desert, because imagine when you go grocery shopping, or if your family goes grocery shopping, you might be coming out of the store with several bags, many of which might be heavy, filled with your food for the week or for however long you've shopped. So imagine if you had to walk to the grocery store and it was, 1.5 miles, 2 miles, 3 miles away. Imagine having to walk back all that way with all these bags, right? So very heavy, very hard to do, also requiring a lot of extra time if you need to walk there. And also consider, can you walk there? Would a person be able to actually walk all that way and then walk all that way back carrying these heavy bags? So, so this is a food desert in an urban area. In a rural area, a food desert is defined actually as more than 20 miles, so living more than 20 miles from the nearest supermarket. So I think a food desert is a really interesting concept because they're actually quite common throughout the United States. And what we see is that areas where we see food deserts, we see greater numbers of low income and obese people, right? And so you hopefully start to see that these environments sort of maybe are part of the cause of overweight and obesity, because if there's lack of access to healthy food and the only options available are sort of inexpensive, energy dense foods, well, what choice does a person have to make? So food deserts are one of the things that contribute to food insecurity and even obesity. So where we see food deserts, we see limited options for healthful food, and also oftentimes limited options for physical activity. This is a picture from your book of a food desert. I don't think it's the greatest picture, but you can kind of imagine, I think these definitions are really apt, right? You can imagine an urban stretch of a city where there is not a grocery store for a mile in any direction. And hopefully you could also imagine, just sort of like vacant country roads where you have to drive forever and ever to actually get to a supermarket. So those are food deserts. And now we're going to talk about, this is kind of like the second to last part of this chapter, but this is the section that goes over like food justice or environmental justice. So talking about equity or justice in terms of food production and sales. So the two groups of people, or two groups of, I guess, workers that we'll talk about in this section are farm workers and food service workers. So what we're going to see in this section is that the working conditions for people who work in the agricultural sector and who work in the food service sector are what your book calls grossly inequitable working conditions. So as a quick overview, farm workers are really poorly paid. They're among the poorest paid in our country, in the United States. And farm labor, depending on the labor, is also very dangerous. It's also very physically demanding, and the environmental conditions can be part of the danger. And then food service, people who work in food service sometimes are often called the working poor, right? Oftentimes they're working 40, even more than 40 hours a week, 50, 55, 60 hours a week. And similar to farm workers, they are among the poorest paid in the United States. So farm labor, let's talk a little bit about people who work in agriculture. So much of agricultural labor is considered contingent work, which means the work is contingent, right? There's no job security. There's oftentimes, I should highlight there's little or no job security, right? There's no guarantee that the work will continue long term. It's also contingent. It's often based on the season. So it's based on when the crops are ready to be harvested, or when maybe new crops need to be planted, or depending on the season of the crop production. So there's very little security in farm work, job security, I mean to say. There's oftentimes no health care, no health insurance provided to farm workers. There's no sick leave or paid time off. There are generally no retirement benefits, and again, the wages are generally the lowest in the United States. Farm workers are often considered migrant workers because they might move from one region of the country to another following the harvest season. So that, if there's harvest in the south, in the southern states during, maybe January, February, but then as the seasons warm in the northern states, these farm workers might move to the northern states to follow the available work as harvest starts to take place, farther north in Pennsylvania or New York or even Vermont or further north. So some of the challenges faced by migrant work and by agricultural work. So again, most people working as farm laborers live well below the poverty line. It is allowed in the United States that children as young as 12 are allowed to work on farms, which means at 12 years old, they're probably not going to school, so they're lacking that opportunity for education. As we saw, farm work is often very dangerous, so we see really high rates of injuries and fatalities. And then some of the environmental conditions. So there's excessive UV radiation from the sun because they're out in these open fields. Oftentimes the work is harvesting the crops. And again, oftentimes there aren't breaks provided during the workday. Oftentimes the workday is sun up to sundown. So it's just full, endless sun exposure. Oftentimes there may not even be enough food provided during the day or access to water to stay hydrated during the day. We talked about what can happen from heat stroke or excessive sun exposure. And then also the way that we do agriculture commonly in this country uses a lot of pesticides. So sometimes that's what these farm workers are doing, is actually they're the ones who have to apply the pesticide. So this sort of excessive and long-term exposure to pesticides is very dangerous to their health. And then they lack access to health care. And then also the housing situations are also what we might call substandard. So again, because of the nature of the migrant work, these people aren't, they don't get to live in the same house all year round. They might just be living in these temporary houses following the work. And so often these houses, they may be provided by the farm owner, but they're often little, shacks or shanties that are, trying to sleep 20 people in a 10-foot by 10-foot space. It may not even be running water or a toilet. So really, really, really poor conditions provided to the people who basically put food on the table of everybody else. And then in food retail and food service work, so these we're talking about like people who cook in kitchens for restaurants. We're talking about wait staff, any sort of food service work, even grocery store workers or people who might work in food production. So it's estimated that about 8.5 million people in the United States work in food service. And again, many of these people also get paid below the minimum wage. So because of that, many of them live below the poverty line. It's estimated that about 22.5 million US households receive SNAP, which is a Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So because these people are living below the poverty line, they may not have enough income to provide healthy food. So one of the US programs, one of the programs in the United States to try to address this is SNAP. So it's a kind of a program to provide monetary assistance to people living below the poverty line to help put healthful food on the table. Also in food retail work, there's often no paid sick time. Often there's no paid vacation time. And many food service workers then might feel compelled to work while they're sick because they won't get paid if they take the time off. And so obviously that can make the illness worse and can also lead to potential transmission of the disease at the workplace. So those are just a few short slides on this issue. This is, again, I think actually one of the most important issues in the conversation about nutrition is basically food justice. Providing fair wages, providing fair conditions to the people in this country who put food on everybody else's table. So I will put up some links in this week's content if you want to read a little bit more about some of these issues. So now we'll kind of transition to the last part of chapter 16, which is kind of like the hopeful send-off, right? Because we've kind of talked about a lot of maybe not so positive issues thus far in chapter 16. So what are some things that could be done, I guess, to address some of these issues around food insecurity, food deserts, climate change, global warming, and food injustices? So here's this concept of sustainability. And I think hopefully a lot of you actually have maybe taken some courses in sustainability or have at least talked about sustainability in some of your other courses here at Corning or maybe elsewhere where you might study. So sustainability we can define as the ability to satisfy humanity's basic needs now, but also in the future. And this is doing so without undermining the natural resources that we have available to us and without undermining the environmental quality on which life depends. Right, so it's basically saying, okay, how can we provide for human beings for what they might need, not just now, but also long term? And how can we provide for humans without basically depleting the resources available on planet Earth and without totally ruining our environment? So sustainable practices, one that we already sort of looked at is the concept of organic agriculture. Sustainable practices would be put into place or are considered or are talked about as a means of reducing pollution. So reducing pollution of the air, basically meaning reducing greenhouse gas emissions, reducing pollution of our soils and our waterways, and also, again, preserving natural resources for future generations. So what does sustainability in the food supply look like? We'll take a little historical perspective here. Because back in kind of the mid 20th century, so just after World War II, we saw a really, really substantial change in agriculture. So this is why you might have noticed me saying in recent chapters, in the past 70 years, in the past 50 to 100 years, our food supply has changed or our way of life has changed. This is actually largely what I'm referring to, is that by about the mid-1900s, after World War II, we saw some substantial changes in agricultural practices, which we're now seeing and have been seeing the effects of in these last maybe 30 to 50 years. So after World War II, there was something called the Green Revolution, which basically shifted the way we do agriculture and made agricultural practices much more industrial. So meaning there was this shift from kind of more, I guess I'll say, how do I want to say, I want to say sort of simple or basic or even like familial agricultural practices where a family or a few families might have managed a tract of land and probably grew some animals, grew a lot of crops to feed their local community. Well, industrializing agriculture means we start to mechanize a lot of agricultural practices. We start to increase the scale of a lot of these practices. It no longer, in this green revolution, agriculture no longer became like a family practice. It became a business first and foremost. And so what we will talk about is how industrial agriculture has threatened our environment and has threatened sustainability. But in the short term, yes, it did increase food supply and it did increase food security. But now we're in this place where it's no longer actually contributing to such a solid food supply, and it's threatening our environment. So industrialized agriculture did improve seed quality for a time. It led to production of fertilizers and pesticides and many different farming techniques that did improve crop yields for a time. And so also in this time, we started to see the advent of more genetic engineering in our food supply and the advent of genetically modified crops or GMOs. And so we also saw different new varieties, I guess, of many of our subsistence crops like wheat, rice, corn, and beans. So as I talked about, and I think it was just in the last chapter in the last week, I put the link to the Rodale Institute, which is an institute, a group of researchers studying the difference between basically industrialized agriculture techniques and more organic techniques. And so yes, industrialized agriculture does increase yield initially, but when we look long term, we see that yield decreases substantially in industrial techniques, and actually organic forms of agriculture will outperform industrial agriculture in the long term. So what are some of these industrial techniques? One of the major shifts we saw is in how we produce animals for human consumption. So basically we've confined animal production, and we have what are called concentrated or confined animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. If you're interested, this is really something worth looking into because it's one of the leading contributors to global warming, actually. So we started to increase the total number of livestock and poultry being produced. So we increased the total number of animals, but we actually reduced the total number of farms. So we basically started making these larger operations, fewer of them, but much larger. So this is that idea of concentrating the animal agriculture sector. So cows, pigs, and chickens are basically raised now in these confined feeding operations. So what that means is you're putting oftentimes thousands or hundreds of thousands of animals in a relatively small space. So their movement is very restricted. It allows the animals to get fatter faster, which means they can be slaughtered faster, which means, quote, the yield would be higher. But again, how sustainable is this is the question we have to ask ourselves at this juncture. So what we see too is that these animals often are quite unhealthy, right? Because imagine yourself if you were stuck in a cage and you couldn't even move around, or you couldn't even scratch your back, and you just lived that way for a certain number of years. Right? How healthy do you think you might be, both mentally and physically? So that's what we're doing with these animals, and then we slaughter them and provide food from their meat. But oftentimes this is precisely the food that is contributing to overweight and obesity and cardiovascular disease and diabetes, because this is the food that is excessively high in saturated fat, excessively high in more pro-inflammatory fatty acids, absolutely devoid of fiber, and oftentimes devoid of other important micronutrients. Also, because of the conditions within these confined animal feeding operations, right, these animals are living in really, really close conditions. And as we've just seen with the coronavirus pandemic, the easiest way for viruses to transmit is by bouncing from one organism to the next. So if you confine these animals very closely, disease can spread so easily. So oftentimes these animals are fed or given a lot of antibiotics to try to reduce the burden of these diseases that can spread so quickly between them. Anyway, there's a lot that I could say here. I'm kind of giving the Cliff Notes version. We could literally have a whole course on this topic. So anyhow, what happened in the short term was that, sure, these concentrated growth animal agriculture systems did increase the food supply. They have increased the food supply. And we could even say it improved nutrition for a lot of people in the beginning because it provided more protein to a lot more people. But now what we're seeing is this is so much of what people eat, and it's at the expense of other foods, again, like fiber-rich foods, like phytonutrient-rich foods. So yes, there was some benefit in the beginning, but now we're at this place where we're seeing all of the both human and environmental cost caused by these industrialized methods of agriculture. So I mentioned on the previous slide that these forms, these CAFOs and other industrialized agricultural techniques are one of the leading contributors to greenhouse gases. It's estimated that about 20% of greenhouse gases come from industrialized agricultural practices. And again, that's both going to be by combination of deforestation and also combination of all of the gas given off by these concentrated animals, right? When they when they fart, when they produce feces, that actually has some greenhouse gases in it, methane gas being one example. And so that's contributing to greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. Also really, I think, eye-opening is that agriculture, industrialized agriculture, uses 70% of the world's freshwater supply, and currently also using about 38% land, or land available for agriculture. As we saw now a few times, industrialized agriculture leads to greater deforestation. We are also converting, though, not only forests, but also other important lands like grasslands and wetlands, converting these to agricultural practices. Again, anytime we're taking down these other natural ecosystems and converting it to farmland, we're going to see issues related to soil erosion and issues related to water supply and water pollution. So yeah, so these forms of agriculture that have such high inputs of fertilizer, such high inputs of pesticides or herbicides, we see that all of that leads to soil pollution and water pollution. And oftentimes that water pollution comes from the excessive runoff of all of these inputs from the local farmland. And when we talk about when we talked about algal blooms in the Finger Lakes, and how we see sometimes in the summer times when the weather is so hot, we might see this overproduction of these toxic algae in the Finger Lakes. Oftentimes that's caused by this runoff from many of the farms that kind of sit up in the hills around the Finger Lakes. So of course that leads to loss of clean water, and it also is reducing soil health. So it's actually reducing the amount of land, this concept of arable land, it's reducing the amount of land that can be used for agriculture. Right, and then we're seeing increase in insecticide-resistant insects and herbicide-resistant weeds. So, right, nature will probably forever outsmart humans and any other creature that tries to outsmart it. But so certainly insects find a way to, you know, it's kind of like the theory of survival of the fittest. So the insects that can resist the insecticide, they're the ones that survive and go on to reproduce. And so then we wind up with insects that don't succumb to insecticide. And the same thing with weeds. The weeds that aren't killed off by the herbicide, they're the ones that get to reproduce. And so we wind up with these herbicide-resistant weeds. So that's why it's really interesting, right? Like these methods of agriculture worked in the beginning, very much so, but they don't work long-term. And that's what we're seeing right now here in kind of the early middle part of the 21st century. Another issue here in industrialized agriculture is this concept of monopolization. So industrialized agriculture reduces food diversity because we kind of monopolize or focus on just a select few crops. So in the United States, for example, the Department of Agriculture, the US Department of Agriculture, subsidizes certain crops, meaning the government gives money to farmers to grow certain crops. And so that means then farmers are sort of put in this between a rock and a hard place, because you know, I think most farmers know that soil diversity and environmental health depends on growing a large number of different crops. But if the government is providing money to grow a select few crops, well then, I mean, it sort of makes financial sense to grow those crops for which you can be guaranteed an income. So 4 of the most commonly subsidized crops in the United States are corn, soybean, wheat, and rice. And so I don't think I've provided an exact statistic here, but these become the most abundant crops that we grow in the United States. And so that's part of what this concept of monopolization is. On the one hand, it's a monopolization of land to grow just a select few crops. But we also see monopolization in terms of the business of agriculture being monopolized. So when we switched to these industrial tactics back in the mid 1900s, as I said, prior to that time, we had a lot of small family, like hundreds of thousands of small family farms across the United States. But as the way of doing agriculture changed, it meant that we started to have a few sort of agriculture businesses that started to buy up small family farms, so that now agriculture and farming is actually basically organized by a select few agricultural businesses. So we see monopolization of agriculture from the economic or financial standpoint as well. So this way of growing just a select few crops, there's a term for that, which is called monoculture. So mono meaning one, culture meaning to cultivate or to grow. So it means that one single crop is grown on a massive plot of land. So this becomes problematic long term because, again, you're losing ecological diversity there, right? You're just growing one thing. Like again, it's very similar even to these confined animal feeding operations. You're putting the same exact thing over a huge swath of land. So this thing, this plant or this animal will become so susceptible to diseases because there's no diversity around it. It's just something with practically the exact same genetics is right next to it in every direction. So because of this way of doing agriculture, the input for pesticides and herbicides and fungicides is much greater because there's no environmental diversity to help sort of naturally keep each of these different crops healthy. There's only one crop being grown, so we need some more, we do use then more artificial means of making sure that crop grows and reproduces or makes its crop, makes its fruit. So that means when we do monoculture, it means we have greater inputs for pesticides and fertilizers, but then it also makes that that crop and that swath of land much more vulnerable to environmental changes. So as weather changes, right, as we have more long days with excessively high heat, as we have more periods of drought, as we have periods of higher winds or heavier rainfall, that particular tract of land that's just growing one crop is going to be much, much more susceptible to any of these environmental issues that might come about. And so then that means that the food supply is much more vulnerable and much more susceptible to not producing enough. So much more likely to see dramatic and sort of sudden food shortages due to these severe weather changes brought about by global warming. Furthermore, monoculture is also reducing variety, right? Kind of jumping back up here. So as we're growing just singular crops, we're reducing the variety of food that we're producing. We're reducing the variety of food available to humans to consume, and therefore we're reducing the variety of our diets. And if we remember back to Unit 1, variety is one of those key components of a healthy diet. So we are actually seeing this. We're seeing a global loss in variety in the various fruits, vegetables, and grains, and even animals that we eat. And so this is yet one more threat to global food security. So one more cause of food insecurity. Think about, even just for a little thought activity, think about when you go to like a gas station, convenience store, or when you go to like more of the junk food aisles, I guess, in the grocery store. And if you can't really think of this, then maybe try this as an experiment next time you go. Look at the ingredients on a lot of those foods, like look at the various bags of chips, or look at various boxes of cereal, or look at various candies or candy bars or snack bars. You hopefully will start to notice a few common ingredients. They're actually written on this slide, right? So what we start to see is that humans are eating a much reduced variety of food. We're actually eating an excessively high amount of corn, an excessively high amount of wheat, and in some cases an excessively high amount of soy. And we're not eating much else unless we really put in the effort to do so. And even just think about when you walk through the produce section and how much diversity of produce is available there and how much of each thing, right? If you're going to go buy beets, how many beets are actually available there? Maybe 15 different people could come through and get beets, and then the beets are gone, right? Whereas if you go to the chips aisle, hundreds of people could come through and get chips before they're gone, right? So we're not producing nearly enough of the healthy foods of various fruits and vegetables as we need to provide healthy food to more people, especially relative to foods made from corn or foods made from potatoes or foods made from wheat. So anyhow, again, this should be actually its own class, is this concept of environmental nutrition and thinking about how we make food and how it's contributing to food insecurity. So what can we start to do to shift some of these agricultural practices? All right, one more sort of doomsday slide, I guess, and then we'll talk about some more positive things, I guess, and things we can do to address a lot of this. So also really interesting, and again, going back to Unit 1, when we introduced the dietary guidelines for Americans, I also introduced the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate. And we didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, but I did make the point to say the dietary guidelines for Americans are our federal government's recommendations around how we should eat to consume a healthful diet. And certainly there's a lot of positive takeaways from the dietary guidelines for Americans, but it's important to note that it is a federal recommendation and that there's a lot of money that goes into influencing those recommendations. And so that's why I give you an alternative perspective like the Healthy Eating Plate written by Harvard University School of Public Health, because there's maybe less political sway in those recommendations coming from the Harvard Public Health Department. So what this page is showing us is different agricultural industries, primarily livestock and other food companies, other parts of the food industry that donate money on a yearly basis to influence the dietary guidelines for Americans. So what we'll see here is that different livestock industries, so the cattle industry, the hog industry, the dairy industry, well, actually dairy is written separately here. So think of the poultry industry, so chicken, even think of egg production, think of beef production, think of pig production. These companies have put more than $300 million per year into the federal government to influence what the dietary guidelines say, right? So that's why there's a strong recommendation around eating meat that comes out of the dietary guidelines for Americans. The dairy industry contributes $6 million. That's why milk has a place on the dietary guidelines for Americans eating plate. But if you look at the Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, dairy doesn't have a place on that plate because the dairy industry isn't lobbying to the Harvard School of Public Health to have a place on that plate. The sugar industry spends more than $11 million to get into, to have a positive reflection in the dietary guidelines for Americans. That's why there isn't a stronger recommendation to reduce added sugar intake. Like when you guys have done your diet analysis project and you see that it says, for a lot of you, it was saying sugars should be about 40 grams or 50 grams a day. But actually, when we look at more research-based recommendations, it suggests that females should not have more than 24 grams of added sugar a day, and males should not have more than 36 grams of added sugar a day. 34, actually, I think it is. So again, and this is in part because the people who work at the USDA and work at the Department of Health and Human Services, they're being strongly influenced monetarily to not be more explicit about the dangers of consuming too much sugar, the potential harm in consuming too much dairy or too much animal protein. And then, so those I think are the big three to make note of and how they've influenced the dietary guidelines for Americans. But then there are also food retail stores. There are also food and beverage companies, which kind of go hand in hand with the sugar companies. And so, and then even alcohol sales, so different food businesses within the beer, the wine, and the liquor world. So really, really interesting, I think, to just understand how our federal dietary recommendations come into being, and how, yes, there are some, again, there are some good recommendations, but these recommendations really aren't telling the whole story. So again, as a consumer, really worth having kind of an open mind and using your maybe natural intelligence to start to question some of these things. Like, is there really any reason we should be consuming 3 glasses of cow's milk a day? Or are we getting fed that recommendation because the dairy industry wants us to think that so that they can continue to make money if we continue to drink cow's milk? Also, I think really fascinating is this statistic on the bottom, which suggests that the US food industry per year produces about twice as many calories per capita, so per person per year, than human beings, than humans in the United States require. So just maybe read that again. So the food industry produces about twice as many calories per capita per year than we actually need to eat. So the food industry profits when we eat, right? That's the business. So the more we eat, the more the food industry profits. The less we eat, the less the food industry profits. So this is basically saying that the food industry is encouraging consumers to overeat so that the food industry can make a profit, right? The food industry is about business. It's not necessarily about human health. Alrighty, so what can we do about all of this? And again, this is just introduction to nutrition. So sometimes I feel like I'm not saying enough, but that's the point here, is to just sort of introduce all of these topics. And then hopefully it will kind of, ignite some interest or some inspiration, and you can kind of go on to learn about these things either on your own time or through school, or hopefully through both. So I mentioned briefly, we talked about the Food and Agriculture Organization that does some work to provide micronutrient supplementation in parts of the world where it's needed. There are many, many different agricultural programs. And actually, I'm sorry, this WHO should be capitalized, WHO. The World Health Organization and UNICEF are two international global health organizations trying to address some of these issues that we've just been discussing in this chapter. Primarily, the World Health Organization and UNICEF have done a lot to improve breastfeeding practices worldwide, because we know that breastfeeding is the best source of nutrition for a newborn baby, even through the first year of life. But of course, breastfeeding is only possible if the recent mother is in good health and can produce healthy breast milk. Again, the World Health Organization and the FAO have done a lot of micronutrient supplement initiatives, so providing micronutrient supplementation to food, especially in children in developing parts of the world. Also, there's been a lot of work in deworming and mosquito control, because we know a lot of viruses and disease can be transmitted that way. And then also there are food assistance programs. And again, these are on a global level, on an international level. We briefly mentioned a food assistance program that exists in the United States called SNAP. But the United Nations is maybe the central organization worldwide that provides food assistance programs. So delivering food to places in the world where there's a shortage of food, where they might be experiencing a famine or a food shortage due to environmental or climate issues or due to war. So food and emergency aid provided by the UN World Food Program. And then circling back to the United States, there are actually a lot of programs both on the national level and even kind of more locally as you look through different states and regions and cities or townships. So on the national level, we have the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. So this is for folks who have an income that is below a certain threshold, are eligible for SNAP, where the government provides dollars, dollar equivalents to purchase certain healthful foods at the grocery store. And then there's also WIC, so the Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, which is abbreviated WIC. So this is both a financial program as well as an educational program to help new mothers understand good nutrition for themselves, their infants, and their children. Two programs that I think are really interesting are the National School Lunch Program and the National School Breakfast Program. So these are, again, federal programs that provide money to schools, will actually provide food to schools to provide lunch and breakfast for children coming from families who do not have enough money to, or whose income meets a certain poverty threshold. And then there's the USDA's Commodity Supplemental Food Program. So again, a means of providing commodity supplements, so more kind of fresh food-based supplements. There's the CDC's Healthy Corner Store Initiative. So this is working with corner store owners, so working in places where there are food deserts, but there might be corner stores or gas station convenience stores. So the Center for Disease Control has done some work to try to encourage these store owners, both the education and sometimes financial resources to provide more healthy, fresh food at these stores, because these stores might be easier access for a lot of people. But if the store is only selling, chips and sodas, well, that's not necessarily addressing the issue of malnutrition. But if these stores can start to sell, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, or even frozen fruit or vegetable, maybe some really simple, healthy to eat meals, like some simple salads or simple breakfasts that are healthy, then that can go quite a long way, because again, these stores are oftentimes in places that we call food deserts, where the supermarket is not nearby. And then I think a lot of people are pretty familiar with the concept of soup kitchens and food pantries. So again, these exist kind of at the town level or at the city level, but various organizations locally, so in a local city or in a town, can set up and do set up soup kitchens, so providing warm prepared meals for people in need, and also food pantries, so providing like pantry staples, so dry goods, foods that people can come and collect and bring home to their houses and cook at a later time. So some examples of some programs that are in place to try to address the lack of access to healthful food. And then on the production side of things, there are lots of shifts, I guess, kind of starting, or that even have been around for a while, trying to shift food production to more sustainable means. So we talked about monoculture, growing one single crop on the same swath of land. So an important shift there is just simply rotating crops. And that can either be by increasing the diversity of crops grown or the variety of crops grown, or it could be simply by moving from one plot of land to the next year over year, so that the soil has a chance to sort of regenerate and recuperate. But really the best thing to do would be to increase the diversity of crops grown and then rotate them. So that would help a lot to reduce soil erosion and to improve soil health and soil ecology. Again, organic farming practices. So we talked about these in chapter 15. So using less herbicide, using less pesticide, using less artificial fertilizer, and just practicing farming through more sustainable methods that look at the ecological system as a whole rather than just the end game of crop production. Moving back towards more family farms and doing less of this sort of industrialized sort of business style of agriculture, but coming back towards more family farming would be a good shift. One of the ways that we can support as consumers, that we can support more family farming, is through support of what's called community supported agriculture, or maybe you've seen this abbreviation CSA, and also, oops, sorry, it didn't work out, and also through buying from farmers markets. So both of these methods basically put the consumer dollar directly into the pocket of small farmers, because generally you can't join a CSA program for a large industrialized farming operation. You can only join a CSA program for a small family farm. And similarly, large-scale industrial farmers don't sell at local farmers markets. Only small individual or family farms sell at farmers markets. So those are two ways to support family farms, or support like moving back towards more family farms. And that's also kind of what this concept of slow food is also. Slow food is actually a movement trying to educate consumers around everything we've just talked about, really, and trying to encourage consumers to put more of their food dollars into the pockets of small-scale local farmers. And then the last thing that's kind of taking hold is this concept of school gardens. So teaching kids from a young age how food is grown, and so getting kids involved in gardening at the schools, making it part of the curriculum, and then also even taking it full circle. So having opportunities for the kids to not only grow these plants in the garden, but then also harvest some of the fruit or harvest the plants and then eat them. So they can kind of see that full circle of from food production, literally from the farm or from the garden to their plate. This is another agricultural technique that would be used less so in the United States, but more in parts of the world with really hilly or even mountainous regions where agriculture is performed. And these are actually relatively older ways of doing agriculture, but it's using these really sloped lands to still grow food, but terracing these sloped features of the land to avoid soil erosion. So this is what terracing looks like. It's basically building these kind of shelves into these sloped hillsides so that even if there's rain or wind, you're not likely to just wash the soil away from this whole hillside. You're gonna have some of these natural barriers built in by terracing the land in this way. So it helps to maintain, again, soil integrity, especially if more trees were left intact along the way. And you can kind of see that it's not like they've stripped all the trees. It looks like there would be little sections, kind of intermittent sections of trees, and then sections of the farmland. Here's a picture of school gardens and community gardens. So I suppose this could be a high school, but there are also school gardens that start even at the pre-K or at the elementary school level. And then it can go all the way up, certainly through high school and even in college. And then there are also community gardens too. Like there's a lot of, in bigger cities, it seems there's a push more towards some rooftop gardens. So, and even community spaces for people to garden together. So if a person or a family or a household doesn't have access to a garden space, from their own apartment building or their own house, these community garden spaces are basically spaces that provide an area for different households to come together and garden together. So that's very cool. And then just a few thoughts about what you as an individual consumer can do, what any individual person can do as a consumer. So supporting food security, some ways we can do that, really focusing on eating, just enough and not too much. So trying to combat this, trying to combat the way in which the food industry is trying to get us to overconsume, instead of kind of giving into that, really focusing on eating a healthy diet, a varied diet for yourself, and not putting as much of your food dollars into these low quality, energy dense foods as much as possible. And in that same vein, kind of this concept of eating mindfully, so eating without distraction, really paying attention to your food, appreciating your food, and reflecting on those who are hungry, also reflecting on all of the people who might have contributed to the food being produced and even making its way to your table. So thinking about the farm workers, thinking about the people who work in various food retail jobs to make it possible for you to even get this food to your plate. Purchasing organic and fair trade. So fair trade is another sort of international program that's focused on fairness just to farm laborers. So it goods that are grown, or foods that are grown, or goods that are produced with this fair trade label tend to meet, or have to, I guess, meet certain requirements. So anything that's grown with this fair trade label means that workers were given a living wage, they were treated humanely and given humane conditions, like an actual home to live in, or access to running water, access to healthful food. There's usually a reduction in child labor, so either fewer hours that a child can work, or a later age at which children can begin working. It also usually includes increased access to education for children. And then fair trade, some of the money from fair trade goods also goes into building schools and building health clinics in parts of the world where these goods are grown. So you'll often see fair trade associated with things like coffee and chocolate, so more of the cash crops that might be grown around the world. So they're not like foods that we need for health and nourishment. They're more sort of supplemental things that we consume out of enjoyment. So here is the fair trade certified label. So when you see this on a food, you can hope that more of these conditions have been met in the production of that food or that good. And then again, just think about I love this concept of your food dollars. So every time you spend money on food, you're putting money into some system of food production or some system of agriculture. So if you're up for it, just be a little bit thoughtful, or maybe a little bit more thoughtful about whose pocket you're putting your money into every time you purchase food. So, if you want to, buy organic foods whenever possible, and then you're putting your money into organic systems of agriculture. Whereas if you buy non-organic food, potentially you're contributing to the perpetuation of more industrialized systems of agriculture. And this doesn't have to be like a 100% of the time, but even just starting to become more aware of this. Go to local farmers markets if you can. There's certainly one in downtown Corning, really nice market, and buy directly from local small-scale farmers. That's, I think, one of the best things we can all do. Also, again, choosing whole foods, choosing less processed foods, right? Typically, when we do that, we're putting money more directly to the farmer and less directly to these large food companies. And then also, it's totally, if you're up for it, offer suggestions to your local grocery store, either in terms of, buying from more local farmers, buying from more small scale farmers, potentially also asking them things like, not putting junk food and candies at eye level for children, or not putting it in the checkout aisle at the grocery store. So again, kind of starting to even shift the whole food environment that we live in, so that we're starting to think more about purchasing healthful food and being less tempted by, all these junk food and high energy density foods. Avoid purchasing and consuming empty calorie foods, again, so kind of the same concept there. And then also, I think a really can be sometimes difficult to consider, but I think really important to consider, is your total meat consumption and dairy consumption. So I mentioned really briefly, but we saw that statistic that industrialized agriculture, particularly livestock, is contributing 20% of the greenhouse gases that we see in the atmosphere right now. So even just reducing meat consumption, it doesn't mean eliminate it, but just consider your meat consumption, and consider also the healthfulness of plant sources of protein. And are there opportunities where you would be comfortable and willing to maybe have a meat-free meal, or even just a smaller portion of meat? And in that way, your money and you are contributing less to these greenhouse gas emissions. There's an interesting figure, I guess, from your book. I didn't put what number it was, but an interesting figure from your book that compares the amount of resources used to produce 1,000 calories of beef relative to 1,000 calories of plant foods. So, let's take a look. So 1,000 calories of beef, which is quite a lot, I guess. I don't know why they chose 1,000, right? But this would be almost a full day's worth of calories. So if for a day all you ate was beef, let's say, that would put 11 times more greenhouse gases into the environment relative to the same day eating a plant-based meal. It would use 8 times more water. It would use 160 times more land, and it would release 19 times more reactive nitrogen into the atmosphere. So quite a reduction, really, in terms of environmental effects when we choose more plant-based meals. And again, this doesn't have to be all of the time, but I would encourage everybody to consider doing this at least sometimes, or doing it actually as often as you can and are willing to, choosing more plant-based meals. So that's the last slide for today. Yeah, kind of an intense lecture, perhaps. I think a really important one, again, given where we're at in terms of kind of being on kind of this tipping point where I think collectively as humans, we need to make some pretty substantial changes to how we're doing things. And certainly food is a necessary part of the conversation. So I'll put some links up so you can kind of read further about a lot of these different issues, and hopefully you may have some interest in getting involved, either professionally or as a volunteer, or simply as a person. Okay, so then this is the end. I'll thumb through the review questions as always. Thanks for listening. And again, if you have questions or comments or anything, please always feel welcome to email me. All right, thank you, and we'll see you next time.